On the 6th of November, 1661, the bells of every parish church in Madrid rang at once, and they did not stop for a full day. A son had been born to King Philip IV of Spain, a male heir, after nearly 4 decades of a family strategy that had already assembled an empire spanning 2 hemispheres through nothing more violent than a signed marriage contract. The boy was christened Charles. Court physicians who examined him in those first weeks noted, carefully and without much alarm in the written record, that his head seemed unusually large for his body, that his tongue filled his mouth in a way that made feeding difficult, and that his jaw already carried the pronounced forward line that every Habsburg since the 15th century had worn in some degree. Nobody in that room connected these details to the family's marriage practices. There was no reason to. The marriages were the reason the family existed at all, and had been for almost 200 years, and a marriage that worked as well as this one had worked, producing a living male heir after so many failed attempts, was not something the court of Spain was inclined to examine too closely. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. A rhyme had attached itself to the House of Habsburg long before Charles was born, and it is usually credited to a Hungarian king who had good reason to resent them. Bella gerant alii, tu felix Austria, nube. Let others wage war. You, happy Austria, marry. It was not really a compliment when it was first said, but the Habsburgs adopted it anyway, because it happened to be true. In 1477, Maximilian of Habsburg married Mary, heiress to the immensely wealthy Duchy of Burgundy, and the Low Countries came into the family without a single soldier crossing a border. In 1496, Maximilian arranged the marriage of his son Philip the Handsome to Joanna, the second daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain. Nobody expected Joanna to inherit anything of consequence. She had an older brother, Juan, and an older sister, Isabella, both already married and both with children of their own to carry the succession. But Juan died in 1497, Isabella died in 1498, and Isabella's infant son died in 1500, and by a chain of funerals nobody had planned for, the crown of a newly unified Spain, along with its expanding American territories, landed on the head of a Habsburg. Joanna and Philip's son, born in Ghent in 1500, grew up to rule more of Europe than any single monarch since Charlemagne, an empire that by his own account never saw the sun set on all of it at once. He is remembered as Charles V, and inside his lifetime he held Spain, Austria, the Netherlands, large stretches of Italy, and a rapidly expanding claim on the Americas, all of it acquired not through war, but through inheritance, through the careful, patient application of exactly the strategy the Hungarian king had mocked. The family never forgot the lesson. For the next century and a half, the House of Habsburg treated marriage the way other dynasties treated armies, as the primary instrument of state, to be deployed with precision and revised the moment the terms stopped favoring them. The difficulty is that an instrument built to acquire territory from outsiders works differently once there are no outsiders left worth acquiring, and by the middle of the 17th century, the Spanish branch of the family had almost run out of them. Charles V's son, Philip II, married 4 times over the course of his reign, first to a Portuguese cousin, then to Mary Tudor of England, then to a French princess, and finally, when none of the earlier marriages had left him a surviving son to his satisfaction, to his own niece, Anna of Austria, daughter of his sister and the Holy Roman Emperor. That 4th marriage produced Philip III, who himself married a Habsburg cousin from the Austrian branch, Margaret of Austria, and their son was Philip IV, the king whose reign this story turns on. By the time Philip IV needed a wife of his own, the family's pool of eligible partners had narrowed, generation by generation, to a small, closed circle of cousins, nieces, and uncles, all descended from the same handful of 15th-century marriages, all still being drawn on because the alternative, marrying genuinely outside the family, meant handing Spanish territory or Spanish influence to a foreign house that had not earned it through 2 centuries of careful paperwork. Philip IV's first marriage, to the French Princess Elizabeth, known in Spain as Isabel de Bourbon, produced 7 children across 2 decades, and 6 of them died before adulthood, a mortality rate that shocked no one, in an era when child death was common, but that nonetheless emptied the nursery of the Alcazar Palace with grim regularity. The one child who survived into his teenage years was a boy named Baltasar Carlos, the pride of the Spanish court, painted repeatedly by the court's own Diego Velázquez in hunting dress and on horseback, groomed from infancy to inherit an empire that stretched from Manila to Lima. In October of 1646, at the age of 16, he caught smallpox at Zaragoza and died within days, and the court that had spent his entire childhood photographing his confidence on canvas was left, almost overnight, with no heir at all. Philip IV was in his early 40s, a widower, ruling the largest empire on earth, and the family had a well-rehearsed answer to a crisis exactly like this one. Marry again, marry close. Keep the succession inside a bloodline the crown already trusted, rather than risk it on a foreign house whose loyalties ran elsewhere. The woman chosen was Mariana of Austria, and the arithmetic of her selection tells you almost everything about where the strategy had arrived by 1649. She was Philip's own niece, the daughter of his sister Mariana and the reigning Holy Roman Emperor Ferdinand III, which made the marriage a reinforcement of the same Spanish-Austrian axis that had produced Philip's own mother a generation earlier. Mariana had, in fact, originally been betrothed to Baltasar Carlos himself, raised from early childhood with the expectation that she would marry her cousin and become queen consort to a boy close to her own age. When Baltasar Carlos died, the engagement simply transferred to his father without much apparent debate at court, a substitution that made bureaucratic sense and almost no human sense at all. Mariana married her uncle in 1649, in the modest town of Navalcarnero, outside Madrid, rather than in the capital itself, because plague was moving through the city that year, and the wedding could not safely be held there. She was 14 years old. He was 44. The portraits Velázquez painted of her afterward, the wide farthingale skirts, the pale hair pulled back beneath a headdress far too formal for a girl her age, show a face that art historians have described for centuries as watchful and closed off, and it is not difficult to understand why. She spent the next 16 years bearing children for a husband 3 decades her senior, in a marriage arranged for reasons that had nothing to do with either of them, and everything to do with an empire that needed an heir carrying the correct surname. 5 children came from that marriage. 3 died in infancy or early childhood, the same pattern of loss that had already claimed 6 of Isabel de Bourbon's 7. A daughter, Margaret Teresa, survived into adulthood, and in a detail that shows how completely the family had committed to the closed circle, she was sent to Vienna in 1666 to marry her own uncle, Emperor Leopold I, continuing the same pattern of intermarriage into yet another generation before she too died young, in 1673, worn down by repeated pregnancy in a marriage that had, like her mother's, been arranged before she was old enough to understand what it required of her. The 5th child of Philip and Mariana was Charles, born in 1661, the boy the bells rang for. He was, on paper, the answer to everything Philip IV had been trying to solve since Baltasar Carlos died at Zaragoza. He was also, though nobody in that christening chamber could have understood the mechanism at work, the product of a pairing so genetically concentrated that a study conducted centuries later would calculate his inbreeding coefficient at close to 1/4, a figure equivalent to what geneticists would expect from the child of siblings, arrived at not through any single incestuous union but through generation after generation of cousins and uncles and nieces marrying inside the same narrow circle of Habsburg blood, each marriage individually defensible, the accumulated total quietly catastrophic. Philip IV died in 1665, when Charles was 3 years old, leaving behind a will instructing that his son be raised under the regency of Queen Mariana until he came of age. What followed at the Spanish court over the next decade reads less like the preparation of a future king and more like the slow, reluctant discovery of how badly the experiment had gone. Charles did not walk without support until he was close to 4 years old. He did not speak in full sentences until later still, and accounts from the palace describe him being carried everywhere by attendants long past the age when other royal children of the period were expected to walk on their own. His jaw, the same feature that had marked every Habsburg portrait since Maximilian, was in his case so pronounced that his upper and lower teeth did not properly meet, which made chewing solid food difficult for his entire life, and left him, according to ambassadors posted to Madrid, reliant on soft, specially prepared food, and prone to drooling that court etiquette required everyone around him to politely ignore. He suffered from recurring seizures throughout his childhood and adolescence. He was slow to learn, prone to persistent illness, and physically frail in a way that alarmed the diplomats reporting home to their own courts, because every one of them understood immediately what his condition meant for the balance of power across Europe. A weak boy king with no obvious prospect of ever fathering children of his own was not simply a domestic Spanish concern. It was a question mark hanging over the largest empire in the world, and by the time Charles reached his teenage years, every rival crown in Europe had already begun, quietly and on paper, preparing for the day it would need an answer. Court records from his childhood describe a boy kept in a kind of protective suspension, breastfed by wet nurses years past the age when royal infants were normally weaned, dressed for far longer than was customary in the loose garments of early childhood, and shielded from the company of other children his own age. Some of this was almost certainly maternal fear rather than mere custom. Mariana had already buried 3 of her 5 children before they reached adulthood, and the surviving accounts of the palace suggest a household organized, quietly and constantly, around the possibility that this 4th child would not survive either. He grew up largely alone, tutored inconsistently, more familiar with the rituals of the court than with the ordinary business of being a boy, and the isolation that was meant to protect him left him, by every report that reaches us from ambassadors and courtiers alike, unusually withdrawn even for a king raised amid the formality of the Spanish throne. The regency itself was a battlefield in its own right. Mariana leaned heavily on her Austrian-born confessor, a Jesuit named Johann Eberhard Nithard, whose rapid rise to the powerful position of Inquisitor General provoked open resentment among the Spanish nobility, who had no interest in watching a foreigner direct the government of a boy king they considered their own. Charles's illegitimate half-brother, Juan José of Austria, the son Philip IV, had fathered outside marriage with a well-known Madrid actress, spent years maneuvering against the Queen's favorites. He forced Nithard into exile in 1669, and in 1677 he seized effective control of the government himself, holding it until his own death in 1679 returned power once again to the Queen's circle. Through all of it, the boy at the center of the crisis grew into adolescence largely absent from his own story, shuttled between rival advisors who wanted control of the regency far more than they wanted the well-being of the child they claimed to be governing on behalf of. Charles was formally declared of age in 1675, at 14, and took up nominal personal rule, though contemporaries at court and ambassadors alike continued for years afterward to describe a king who struggled with sustained attention, who was frequently unwell, and who relied heavily on whichever advisor currently held his mother's confidence rather than exercising independent judgment of his own. The single most urgent matter of his entire reign was one that could not be discussed openly in any council chamber. Spain needed an heir, and Spain needed to determine, as delicately as such a thing could be established at all, whether its king was capable of producing one. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The first attempt came in 1679, when the 17-year-old Marie-Louise of Orleans arrived in Madrid to marry her cousin, the 18-year-old King of Spain. She was French, a niece of Louis XIV, raised at Versailles among the most sophisticated and openly ceremonious court in Europe, and by nearly every surviving account she found her new home unbearable. Spanish court etiquette in the late 17th century was famously rigid, built around a code of formal distance and religious solemnity that even Spanish-born queens frequently found suffocating, and Marie-Louise had grown up in exactly the opposite world, one of music, open conversation, and public gaiety. Letters and diplomatic dispatches from the period describe a young queen who wept in private, who begged relatives in France for news of home, and who was watched at nearly every hour by ladies-in-waiting whose ultimate loyalty ran to the Queen Mother rather than to her. The customs of the age extended into the most private corners of the marriage as well. Each month that passed without any indication of pregnancy was noted, discreetly but persistently, and the substance of those notes traveled by courier to foreign chancelleries, as though it were a matter of state, which, in every sense that mattered to the men running Europe's governments, it was. She and Charles were reported by those close to them to have felt genuine affection for one another, which makes the years that followed harder to read rather than easier. 10 years passed. No child arrived. In February of 1689, Marie-Louise died suddenly, after a brief and severe illness, officially attributed to appendicitis, at the age of 26. The suddenness of her death, weighed against the enormous political stakes riding on the royal marriage, produced immediate rumors of poisoning at courts across Europe, rumors that were never substantiated and that most historians treat with real skepticism today. But the fact that they were taken seriously at all, by ambassadors and monarchs who considered themselves rational men, tells you how much pressure had built around one unanswered question. Spain did not wait long to try again. The council that effectively ran the kingdom's foreign policy chose the second wife, with a colder, more clinical logic than the first marriage had followed. Mariana of Austria came from a German family famous across Europe for its fertility. Her mother, the Countess Palatine, had borne 17 children who survived to be named and recorded. If the difficulty lay somewhere in the pairing rather than in the king himself, a bride drawn from a demonstrably fertile line seemed, to the men negotiating the match, the most rational insurance available to them. Charles married her in 1690. She was intelligent, politically engaged, and closely tied to the interests of the Austrian branch of the family, a connection that would matter enormously in the crisis still to come. And across another full decade of marriage, she bore no children either. By the late 1690s, the pattern had become impossible for anyone in Europe to interpret as anything other than exactly what it appeared to be. The King of Spain was not going to have an heir from any wife by any arrangement the diplomats could devise. What happened next says as much about the rest of Europe as it does about Spain, because the great powers did not wait for Charles to die before they began dividing his empire on paper. In 1698, England and France signed the first partition treaty, quietly agreeing to hand most of the Spanish inheritance to a 6-year-old Bavarian prince named Joseph Ferdinand, whose own claim ran through his mother, Maria Antonia, herself a daughter of Emperor Leopold and the ill-fated Margaret Theresa, meaning the compromise candidate was, in a small and bitter irony, Charles's own great-nephew. It was a plan meant to prevent either the French Bourbons or the Austrian Habsburgs from swallowing the whole of Spain's possessions and tipping the balance of the continent. Joseph Ferdinand died the following year, probably of smallpox, and the treaty had to be renegotiated from nothing. A second partition treaty followed in the spring of 1700, splitting the inheritance directly between France and Austria, with Naples, Sicily, and the Duchy of Milan going to France and the core of Spain itself, along with its American territories, designated for the Austrian claimant, Archduke Charles. Word of the plan reached Madrid and infuriated the Spanish court, since it treated the empire Spain had spent 2 centuries assembling as a set of assets to be parceled out by foreign chancelleries before its own king was even in the ground. Inside the palace, meanwhile, the explanation people reached for was not diplomatic at all. It was supernatural. Charles's health through the 1690s had deteriorated into a condition contemporaries genuinely struggled to account for using the medicine available to them. Premature aging, digestive failure, swelling in his limbs, recurring seizures, and a general exhaustion that made him look, in the words of more than one visiting ambassador, decades older than his actual age. The explanation that gained the widest traction at court was that the king was hechizado, bewitched, cursed through sorcery by an enemy of the crown. It was not a fringe belief confined to servants and stable hands. The crown's own inquisitors took it seriously enough to open an investigation, and in the final years of his reign, exorcisms were performed on Charles himself, with clergy attempting to identify and expel whatever malign influence was believed to be responsible for a body that 17th-century medicine had no framework to explain. Physicians, for their part, tried remedies of their own that read today as scarcely less desperate, bleeding him repeatedly, purging him, and at various points applying the remains of freshly killed animals to his body in the hope of drawing out whatever was wrong. The nickname stuck to him for the rest of history: Charles the Bewitched. It is, in its own way, one of the more honest labels history has attached to a monarch, because in a sense he genuinely was cursed, just not by an enemy's spell. He was the accumulated result of 200 years of a family solving every succession crisis in exactly the same way, and by the time the bill came due, no exorcism was going to undo it. His mother, Mariana, who had shaped so much of his life from the day he was born, died in 1696, 4 years before her son, having outlived the husband, the daughter, and very nearly the entire generation of Habsburgs who had built the arrangement that produced him. The final year of Charles's own life is documented in unusual detail, because by 1700 every court in Europe had ambassadors stationed in Madrid whose primary task was reporting, almost day by day, on the state of the king's body. Through that summer and autumn he grew progressively weaker, unable to keep food down, his limbs swollen, drifting in and out of consciousness for long stretches. On the 3rd of October, 1700, in what everyone around him understood to be his final weeks, Charles signed a new will. It was a reversal of years of prior Spanish policy. For most of the preceding decade, The Spanish court had leaned towards some version of the partition plans, a divided inheritance that would prevent any single power from becoming overwhelming. Charles's final decision rejected that entirely. He named Philip, Duke of Anjou, the 17-year-old grandson of Louis XIV of France, as sole heir to the whole of the Spanish Empire, undivided, on the strict condition that the crowns of France and Spain never be joined under a single ruler. It was, by most readings historians have offered since, an attempt to keep the empire intact rather than see it carved apart by treaty among foreign powers who had never governed an acre of it. When Charles died on the 1st of November 1700, one day short of what would have been his 39th birthday, he had reigned for 35 years and left no children from either marriage. The report drawn up after his post-mortem examination has been repeated in histories of Spain for 3 centuries, and whatever allowance is made for the limits of 17th century medicine, it reads like the closing exhibit in a case that had been building since 1649. His heart, the surgeons recorded, was the size of a peppercorn. His lungs were corroded. His intestines were rotted and gangrenous. He had a single testicle, described in the report as black. His head, they noted, was found to be full of water. Whatever precise clinical accuracy that document carries by modern standards, what it captures without any ambiguity is the impression of a body that had been failing on every front at once for years, observed and written down by men who had no vocabulary for what they were looking at beyond the plain physical fact of it in front of them. Louis XIV accepted the will on his grandson's behalf, and court chroniclers recorded him declaring, upon doing so, that the Pyrenees no longer existed, a line quoted in histories of the period ever since, whether or not those were his exact words. The rest of Europe did not accept the arrangement quietly. Within a year, England, the Dutch Republic, and Austria had formed a grand alliance against the union of French and Spanish interests they believed the will represented regardless of its stated conditions, and the War of the Spanish Succession consumed the continent for the next 13 years, fought from the Low Countries to the Italian peninsula to the mountains of the Iberian frontier, with a colonial extension of the same conflict burning through English and French territory in North America under a different name. It became one of the largest and most expensive conflicts Europe had fought to that point, drawing in armies from Bavaria, Portugal, Savoy, and the German states alongside the principal combatants, and it produced casualties across the continent numbering, by most modern estimates, in the hundreds of thousands. It ended with the treaties of Utrecht and Rastatt in 1713 and 1714, which confirmed Philip of Anjou as King Philip V of Spain, while formally and permanently separating the French and Spanish crowns, precisely as Charles's will had specified. Austria received the former Spanish Netherlands and Spain's Italian possessions as compensation for accepting the outcome. Britain came away with Gibraltar and the island of Minorca, footholds it has held, in Gibraltar's case ever since. The House of Habsburg, after nearly 200 years on the Spanish throne, was finished in Madrid. The House of Bourbon, French in origin, has occupied that throne ever since, through the Napoleonic occupation and the restoration that followed it, through a short-lived republic in the 1930s, through the Civil War and the long dictatorship that came after, and through the monarchy's own restoration in 1975 under King Juan Carlos I, down to the king who sits on it today, a descendant, in an unbroken line, of the 17-year-old boy, a childless Habsburg king, named as his heir in a will signed a month before his own death. In 2009, a team of researchers at the University of Santiago de Compostela, led by the geneticist Gonzalo Alvarez, published a study that had gone looking for the mechanism behind everything the ambassadors of 1700 had described without ever understanding it. Working from genealogical records reconstructing 16 generations and more than 3,000 individuals across the Spanish and Austrian branches of the family, they calculated Charles's inbreeding coefficient with a precision no 17th century physician could have approached, and they proposed that his combination of symptoms, the growth failure, the digestive collapse, the infertility, and his early death, was best explained not by one rare condition but by 2 occurring together: a combined pituitary hormone deficiency layered onto a kidney disorder known as distal renal tubular acidosis, both entirely plausible outcomes of the specific, repeated concentration of Habsburg blood recorded in his family tree. The study did not need to invoke witchcraft, or poison, or simple misfortune. It needed only the marriage records, the same records the family itself had kept with such meticulous pride for 2 centuries as proof of its own success. What had once been read, generation after generation, as the surest sign of the dynasty's discipline turned out, laid out on a modern geneticist's spreadsheet, to be a slow and largely self-inflicted count towards zero. What remains of it now is scattered in ways easy enough to overlook if you are not specifically looking for them. The portraits still hang in the Prado in Madrid, painted first by Velázquez and later by Juan Carreno de Miranda, who took over as court painter and recorded Charles as a boy and then as a grown king, the jaw unmistakable in every one of them, rendered by artists who had no particular reason to soften a feature everyone at court had long since stopped remarking on out loud. The marriage contracts survive in Spanish and Austrian archives, dry legal instruments that built an empire clause by clause across 2 centuries, and then, through the same logic applied 1 generation too many, quietly ended it. Navalcarnero, the small town outside Madrid where a 14-year-old girl married her uncle in 1649 because plague had closed the capital, still stands, and the parish church where the wedding took place is still there for anyone who wants to find it. The throne itself, the one specific object the entire crisis had been about, sits today in Madrid occupied by a family whose right to it traces back through Philip V to a grandson sent from France, more than 3 centuries removed from the will an exhausted, childless king signed in his final weeks, trying to keep together an empire his own family's marriages had spent 200 years assembling, and that one final marriage, layered onto too many before it, had quietly and irreversibly made impossible to pass on. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.